At first glance, the Sahara Desert seems like the last place you'd look for hidden history. A lifeless sea of sand stretching over 9 million square kilometers, scorching, dry, and desolate. Surely no civilization could have survived, let alone thrived, in a landscape so brutal. But recent scientific and archaeological discoveries suggest we may have overlooked something profound, an entire chapter of the human story buried beneath the dunes. What if the Sahara we know today wasn't always a desert? What if, in the not-so-distant past, it was one of the most fertile and hospitable regions on Earth? This idea isn't hypothetical, it's backed by science. For nearly 9,000 years, from around 14,000 to 5,000 years ago, North Africa was lush, green, and alive. Rivers flowed through grasslands, forests spread across what is now barren sand. Vast lakes teemed with fish, elephants, giraffes, and antelopes roamed freely, and yes, so did humans. This period is known as the African Humid Period, and it didn't end millions of years ago, it ended just 5,000 years ago, practically yesterday in the grand timeline of civilization. And that's where things get interesting, because the African Humid Period ends right when mainstream history tells us civilization began. Around 5,000 years ago, the first great societies emerge: ancient Sumer, the Indus Valley, and most notably ancient Egypt. But this timeline presents a paradox. Egypt, which rose in the very region where the Sahara was drying, appears to flourish not in abundance, but in the aftermath of catastrophe. Why would one of history's most iconic civilizations emerge just as the environment around it collapsed? The Sahara didn't fade gradually. Scientific models show the transition from green paradise to brutal desert happened rapidly, within just a few centuries. The Earth's axial tilt shifted, weakening the monsoon system that brought rain to North Africa. As rainfall diminished, vegetation died. With fewer plants to absorb sunlight, the land began to reflect more solar energy, accelerating the drying process. A runaway climate feedback loop ensued, and in a geological blink, the Sahara flipped from green to gold. It was a mass extinction, not just of plants and animals, but of entire ways of life. For those living there, the transformation would have been catastrophic. But what if they didn't simply disappear? What if they migrated eastward toward the last green corridor in the region, the Nile River? Could it be that ancient Egypt wasn't the beginning of civilization, but its continuation? A legacy born from the collapse of a much older, now forgotten culture that once thrived across the Sahara? It may sound speculative, but the ancient Egyptians themselves seemed to believe exactly that. They never portrayed themselves as the first. In their eyes, they were the inheritors of a vast and ancient tradition. Three of Egypt's most important historical records, the Abydos King List, the Turin King List, and the Palermo Stone, each describe a lineage of rulers stretching far beyond the first dynasties, not by a few centuries, but by tens of thousands of years. Modern Egyptologists dismiss much of this as myth. They argue these ancient king lists include gods, spirits, and demigods, and therefore cannot be taken literally. But here's the problem. The Egyptians never made this distinction. To them, these were their ancestors, part of an unbroken lineage that stretched deep into prehistory. The division between historical and mythical rulers is a modern invention, not an ancient one. And there's more. The Egyptians spoke often of a place called the Land of the West, a fertile paradise beyond the known world, tied to the afterlife but also described in surprisingly geographic terms. In the Book of the Dead, it's called the Field of Reeds, a realm of flowing water, crops, and abundance. Scholars usually interpret this as symbolic, but what if it wasn't entirely metaphorical? Could it be a fading cultural memory of the Green Sahara? It's not just Egypt. Centuries later, classical scholars like Ptolemy described lakes, rivers, and settlements deep in what is now the Central Sahara. What's remarkable is that many of the features he recorded line up closely with ancient riverbeds and paleo lakes that modern scientists have only recently rediscovered using satellite imagery. How could he have known that? Unless this knowledge had been preserved, passed down from a time when those lands were still alive. Evidence for a once thriving Sahara doesn't stop at maps and mythology. Genetic studies tell a striking story. DNA samples from sites like Taforalt in Morocco, dating to 15,000 years ago, show a mix of sub-Saharan and Near Eastern ancestry. This points to long-distance contact, trade, and likely migration across a once navigable Sahara. And this genetic blend doesn't vanish. It shows continuity into later populations in the Nile Valley. The very people who built dynastic Egypt may well have been descendants of Saharan cultures displaced by climate collapse. And then there's the archaeology, the physical remnants that hint at something far older than we've been told. In southern Egypt, the site of Nabta Playa contains stone circles aligned with the summer solstice, dating back to at least 7,500 BC. That's over 2,000 years before the first pyramids. The site also includes ceremonial structures, cattle burials, and evidence of astronomical knowledge. In the central Sahara, regions like Tibesti, Fezzan, and Mesak Sedefet, archaeologists have uncovered burial mounds with tools, jewelry, and pigments. These are not primitive campsites. They are ritual burials, organized, intentional, and deeply symbolic. In the Niger Basin, sites like Gobero tell us of an aquatic culture that thrived around vast lakes during the humid period. The people buried here were not wandering nomads. They lived in communities, crafted fishing tools and jewelry, and practiced ceremonial burials with ochre and ornaments. These societies flourished around 8,000 BC, thousands of years before recorded history in Egypt. And high on the sandstone cliffs of Tassili in Algeria, over 15,000 rock engravings tell the story of a lost world. Dated as far back as 10,000 BC, the images depict humans in elaborate robes and headdresses, herding cattle, performing dances, and living in domed huts. These were not simplistic hunter-gatherers. They were organized cultures with spiritual traditions, settled dwellings, and artistic expression. Of course, none of this proves the existence of a grand lost civilization beneath the Sahara. The evidence is suggestive, not conclusive. But one thing is certain: we've barely begun to look. Less than 1% of the Sahara has been explored using modern archaeological techniques. Political instability, extreme heat, and sheer logistical challenges have left most of this vast desert untouched by science. What lies beneath those endless dunes, stone foundations, buried inscriptions, forgotten cities, we simply don't know. Thank you for watching. If you found this journey as fascinating as we did, subscribe to Ancient Epochs for more.